Good morning, everyone. My name is Tom Hollowell, the IOF Secretary General and CEO, and welcome to this digital high-level events seminar being held for the first time this year. I look forward to seeing the presentations and participating during the day. I've been asked to kick it off with an update and information about the council project that's going on right now regarding fairness and orienteering. In other words, Fair Play and Ethics Working Group. The background for this work is, as many of you know, the happenings at the World Military Games in Wuhan, China in 2019, where I think the entire orienteering world was a bit shocked by the way that it was possible to manipulate results. Now, in the end of the day, the results were nullified, so the rules worked okay as they did, but it was kind of a shock to the system. This led the IOF to look at what is the status of fair play and orienteering. And we did a survey in late 2019 and early 2020 to have a look at that and see what the views on fair play. And it turned out that there is a need to review how we build the basic values of our sport regarding fair play. This also then resulted in a proposal from the Finnish Orienteering Federation to the IOF General Assembly last July. And in fact, the General Assembly made a resolution together regarding fair play and ethics. The resolution is on this page. There's some background text at the start of it, but then the resolution really which was edited and commented quite a bit by the members that were present at the General Assembly, really gets into the core of protecting the vulnerable nature of our sport. It proves that orienteering is a sport where it is possible to play unfairly by pre-knowledge of terrain, courses, and so on, by kind of manipulating some of the basic things about it. It's very important then that we build the values of fair play. And also, the members said it's important that we review and look at our rules, our guidelines, our norms. And as I said, also important with enforcement mechanisms, sanctions, whatever, to make sure that we are maintaining the fairness of competitions. And that is the background, actually, for the IOF's work going further with this. And in the council, we've discussed it as far as let's say, a fair play strategy. And to demonstrate this or to illustrate this, we've built what we call this fair play house. And the fair play strategy is based upon, of course, the foundation of our ethical values and the foundation of having the highest ethical standards of fairness. The mission of all of this, of course, is to show that we're committed to fair play and to promote fair play in orienteering. And the vision, of course, is that we would be recognized as a sport that shows ethics and fair play in everything that we do. And to reach this, we have a strategy that says we want to work in 4 different areas: clarifying rules and making appropriate sanctions to enforce those rules, making clear guidelines to stakeholders. That could be athletes, organizers, event officials, whatever. And that we work on value-based education for all of our members. And then finally, pillar not to be forgotten, of course, is the work that we do with compliance to the World Anti-Doping Code, which anti-doping, of course, is very important to our fair play work. The council, after the General Assembly, decided to put together a council working group looking at fair play. And the working group is, in fact, led by council and is actually led by the president, Leo Haldner. And one of the vice presidents, Mike Dowling, is involved, and we have other members from council. We have members from all of the discipline commissions, the various support commissions in the IOF, IT, MAP, and rules. And then also representatives from the athletes commissions and from the IOF office. The work of the working group has been divided into 3 sub-working groups. One looking at how do we improve guidelines, and to a large degree, this is about the principles of fair play, led by Leo. Rules and sanctions, led by Mike Dowling, and looking at an education tool, which is led by myself. The work of the group is very much gone back to the Fair Play survey that was done in 2019 and 2020. And what we've done is use the survey to identify areas where we need to look at, where are areas that we need to work upon. And that means identifying the areas that mostly impact fair play. And the working group has done kind of a reassessment of the survey values. I'll get back to that. But we've also extended this with some additional topics and areas. There were things that were not in the original survey that were identified either in free text answers to the survey or based just upon the working group experience, things that need to be added in that impact fair play. So from the original survey, this was kind of a list of the things that were looked at and things that could impact upon fair play. So for example, the things that were seen to have the most impact at the bottom of the screen here were things like passing through a forbidden area on the course to gain time advantage or having access to the courses ahead of the competition day. Whereas, of course, there were many things that were seen to have less impact and, of course, maybe even shouldn't really be considered as things that are fairness. They're things that are possible for everyone, like setting your own courses ahead of time to guess possible legs, training in similar terrain areas. They're not really forbidden things or anything, but they could have an impact on fairness from not everyone being able to do the same things, but they're maybe not considered as having the same dignity of impact, if you will. So the working group took the things that were involved in the original survey. But as I said, we also saw that there were a number of things that needed to be added to that based upon the comments and based on the experience of the group. An example of that might be that, for example, in mountain bike orienteering, cutting across trails, not staying on the trail network, crossing across non-rideable areas is seen as something that has a very high impact on the fairness of the competitions. Breaking of the quarantine rules is something also that's seen could have a very high impact upon fairness. So the working group looked at the survey, but also added in a number of additional areas, and then made a final rating based upon what do these things impact. That rating then resulted in a number of things that we say have very high impact, have high impact, have moderate impact, and have low impact upon the basic fairness of competitions. And this is then useful to look at what areas do we need to prioritize. But beyond, as far as prioritization goes, looking not only at the impact of different things, it's also important to look at a risk analysis. So the working group did a risk analysis looking at then not only what the impact is, but then looking at what's the likelihood of these things kind of actually happening. So, for example, having access to the courses ahead of time on the competition day, of course, can have a very high impact. But in fact, the risk of that happening as we see it today is quite minimal. We have good control in most cases of the courses, and there's a minimal risk of that happening. So yeah, we need to look at that, but it's maybe not one of the first things. However, for example, bringing a communication device into the quarantine has a high impact on fair play, and the way we deal with it today in our guidelines and rules seem that there could be a very high risk that this, and we actually have in the working group, for example, been able to discuss examples of where there have been cases where communication devices have been brought into quarantine and used. Whether it impacted the competition or not is not to say, but there have been examples, and therefore we see this as something that has a very high risk of happening in addition to its very high impact on fair play. So this risk analysis was done on all of the same impact areas, and that risk analysis now is used to prioritize the areas to address. So in other words, if you take a look at all of those various areas and you put them into a matrix where at the top here we have the impact of fair play, and on the side we have then the risk, if you will, of the probability of these things actually happening. Then you get the pink area is the things that are very high or high risk and probability. The yellow area is more moderate impact, and then low impact and lower risk are in the outside column. So what the working group has decided is to really look at these pink areas, which are where there's a very high or high impact and where there's a very high or high probability of things happening. Those are the things that we're looking at prioritizing in the initial work of the group. So some of the areas that we've looked at or started looking at, and where we see that there are some weaknesses in both guidelines and in rules, is, for example, the area of quarantines, both the practicalities of how you set one up. What is a proper quarantine? How do we define that? We feel that there's a need for better guidelines in this area. The do's and don'ts of quarantine. So in other words, both for organizers, for athletes, and so on, what are you allowed to do in a quarantine, and what should you not do in a quarantine? And we've discussed, for example, of examples where athletes may be very well aware that they should not have devices in quarantine, but where it's been known that organizers actually have been in the quarantine and following the GPS tracking of the competition to try to know what's going on in the competition while actually being in the quarantine. And maybe that's not an appropriate thing to do, and that needs to be clarified in guidelines. Another area that we've looked at is, in fact, the use of telecommunications equipment. And the rules today cover a little bit about what you're allowed to use on the course. But for example, in quarantine, before and after competitions, what guidelines and rules and potential sanctions do we need to put in place regarding the use of telecommunications equipment? Another area that we've looked at briefly is the following of marked routes. This is, again, an area that there have been issues in competitions where athletes have not followed the marked routes, and what can we do in guidelines to improve that and to improve the athletes' following of the rules, and what needs to be improved in the rules as well regarding that. Another area that needs to be discussed as far as guidelines go, maybe primarily, is the sharing of competition information during a competition. Things like coaching zones, announcers, and big screen, the use of big screens in the arena, what can potentially be giving competition information to competitors beforehand, and so on. And what guidelines need to be established to give ideas of how to regulate that properly. One that's kind of more in the low-hanging fruit area, in other words, one of the things that maybe is not, again, this probably has a minimal risk, but it's a high impact, is protecting information prior to the competition, but also looking at organizers' conflict of interest, where you, in the organizing committee, may contain people who have a conflict of interest with, say, an athlete participating in the competition. And then we need to make sure that that is well identified and monitored by the organizing committee and so on. So some guidelines and thoughts around how we can work with conflict of interest and also protecting information. For example, having non-disclosure agreements in place with those involved in course and map information, both map suppliers, mappers, and so on, so that we have an appropriate level of protection of that information going forward. And then, of course, there are some discipline-specific areas that have been identified and have started to look at. For example, the Mountain Bike Commission is looking at this area of cutting in MTBO, and the Trailo Commission is looking at maybe clarifying and establishing better rules for Trailo eligibility than what we have today. So kind of a working group, or a working method for the working group, has been that we agree on the principles in the working group. So for example, for these areas we've discussed, what are the principles that we want to be applicable in guidelines and rules, and then synchronize that with education. So analysis and a definition of the clarifications that are needed, establishing the appropriate guidelines for organizers, for athletes, for others, and then synchronizing that with the education tool. When we get to the education tool, the idea of the education tool and the way it will be built is in two segments, Fair Play 101, which is really something for all orienteers. It could be youths, it could be veterans, it could be basically all of the members that participate in orienteering, and going through the basics of orienteering and what are the things that impact our competitions and how should athletes function within the rules and guidelines that we have, and what is the athlete's responsibility, kind of basic in the building the basic values of fair play and orienteering through that. Fair Play 102 would be based very much upon the more competitive orienteering. This is areas for those participating in IOF events to understand the rules and guidelines in more detail before a competition, during a competition, and post-competition, as far as what are the obligations, but also what are the rights that a competitor has in those cases. So things like embargoes, things about quarantines during the event, and the spreading of competition information. Post-event is things more about reporting jury decisions, how an appeal process would work. The education tool is being built upon what we call education stories. So it will be a very much stories-based or trying to get those participating in doing it in an interesting way and getting a relation to what is actually being told. The final content for the education tool will be based upon the rules and guidelines and the principles that are involved there. To give an example of stories, for example, these are two things, for example, in Fair Play 101. One might be this issue of following mandatory routes. So the issue is not passing the start point or not following a mandatory route, and how do we want to try to teach that? So you build kind of a basic story about something that could plausibly happen, or maybe in many cases an example of something that actually has happened in a competition. And then around that, we build a number of quiz questions that to kind of make sure that people have an understanding of the issue. So things like how is a mandatory route marked on the map? How is it marked in the terrain? Giving them images to where they need to choose the correct image, that this is the way it's marked. Asking them kind of a quiz question: who's responsible for passing the start point? Is it the course setter or is it the competitor? Which of course it is in this case. And things about when you have broken a rule, what do you need to do? Then a second case from more the Fair Play 102, which is for the competitive orienteering, is around the use of a cell phone in quarantine, and kind of determining and building a story about something that plausibly could happen, and then what type of quiz questions do we need? And some of these more related also to an organizer. What should you do if you see someone using a device in quarantine? In addition to the areas that we've talked about, there's a couple of other issues that have come up in our work that we are considering in the working group. And one of them is this need for an expert disciplinary body. And this is kind of a body above, would be an expert body that's an expert on our competition rules. And there's two major areas where we would need this potentially. One is for ruling between events. Our rules today are very much based upon events. It covers very well from the start of an event to the end of an event, but it doesn't cover as much what happens during an event. We had, for example, a case in the run-up to Walk 2018 in Latvia, where we had a breach of the embargo. And by our rules, it was very difficult to know with who should actually deal with that issue. Eventually, the council made a ruling where an athlete was suspended for a period of time due to the breaking of an embargo. But in fact, the council even had difficulty finding good support in the rules for how this was to be dealt with. So there may be this need for a disciplinary body that can deal with issues that happen between events. The second thing is appeals to jury decisions or referrals from the ethics panel. This was something that's actually been raised by the ethics panel, that they have had cases referred to them where the best case I think to refer to is the European Ski Orienteering Championships in 2017, where the rule or the case referred to the ethics panel actually had to do with a conflict of interest in the jury. The jury had ruled and actually had chosen to remove a leg in the course, which of course is not in accordance with our competition rules. But it was found that there was a conflict of interest, that the jury members had a conflict of interest because they had athletes participating in the competition. They were coaches of some of the teams. The ethics panel could rule in the conflict of interest case, but they did not feel that they had the competency or were the right place to rule upon actually the rules breach, which was this removing of the leg of the course. So in fact, the only thing that they could do, and by our rules, since a jury's decision is final, they could only say that the competition result should stand, even if it was found that the jury was not correct because there was a conflict of interest. So this might be a case as well where you need this possibility of having an appeal for jury decisions that are incorrectly concluded, or where there would be referrals from the ethics panels on rules-related issues. This might also be a good case where you have possibility of analyzing jury decisions that are made over time for consistency and to make recommendations to improvements of the rules where we see that juries have had maybe inconsistencies or difficulties in ruling based upon our rules as they are today. The other thing that the group is looking at also is a possibility of, or do we need a possibility of have sanctions others than just disqualification? Today, our rules say that you can be disqualified for breaking a rule, but we really don't have any other possibilities of having lesser sanctions. So should there be time penalties, for example, for rules infractions? But also on the other case, should there be sanctions set automatically set for more serious infractions, similar to what we have in the anti-doping rules, where anti-doping rules give, for example, a 2-year suspension or 4-year suspension for the breaking of certain anti-doping rules. And in fact, in accordance with this fourth pillar of the strategy, our WADA compliance really gives us a pretty good model for how we can deal with our rules and guidelines within our own, let's say, sport. Our IOF anti-doping rules are very clear, based upon WADA rules. They give very clear and standardized sanctions for the breaking of the rules. There's a very, very thorough hearing, ruling, and appeals process outlined there. There are guidelines for organizers, anti-doping officials, and athletes in the standard protocols that they have within WADA. And WADA actually also presents a very good education platform with this type of story-based education. And that's what we have chosen to model our education platform on. And the WADA platform is called Adele. For any of those, I would propose looking into it. You can find it via our homepage or via WADA. So the status and the future work. So we have sub-working group meetings about every 2 or 3 weeks to go through the different guidelines and issues. The impact and risk analysis is now complete, and we're starting to look at these principles in the areas that we need to clarify and strengthen. Documents need to be created and updated, and this will primarily be done by the commissions. Rules changes need to be implemented by the Rules Commission and on the basis of the sub-working group's work. And the education tool development will be based upon the priority areas and based upon the clarifications that come out of, let's say, the work on the principles that we have going forward. The next step really for showing something is a report to the IAOF President's Conference in 2021. So the work is ongoing. It's now time for questions and discussions. And I just there was one question that was sent in advance of the presentation, and I'll field that already now. And it was basically, can the IOF Code of Ethics and Fair Play be highlighted in advice to team managers and event bulletins? And I mean, absolutely. I think it's an excellent idea to include a text in event bulletins regarding fair play and ethics with reference to the Code of Ethics and our Fair Play rules. And I think it's probably appropriate to bring it up in connection with the first team managers meeting in an event. And we'll bring this matter back to the working group to see if, for example, we can put it into guidelines regarding bulletins or even the rules in bulletins. This needs to be a section included in bulletins in the future. So with that, I'll conclude my presentation and open it up for questions and discussion. Thank you very much.